All right, hello everyone and welcome to the webinar titled, Are You in the Driver's Seat for Your ELD Implementation? My name is Brittany Wooten, Community Manager for EROAD. I will be facilitating the webinar this morning. Thank you so much for joining us. With the ELD mandate around the corner, we know getting drivers and back office staff ready is top of mind, so we hope you will find our implementation tips helpful. Before we begin, I'm going to go over a few ground rules, but first, I'd love for you all to participate in our poll. Take a look at your screen for the question. We'd like to understand a little bit more about some of the pain points you envision as you transition to ELD. You can also select more than one answer, just so you know. And while you fill that out, we'll go over a few housekeeping items for today's session. If you have any technical difficulties or issues with the audio, please let us know right away by IMing us in the chat box. We will also have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so if you have any questions while you're listening in, feel free to submit them in the question box and we will get to them at the end. In addition, the slides will be emailed out to you after our session. And now, to introduce today's webinar experts, we have Soona Lee, EROAD's Regulatory Compliance Manager. She is responsible for understanding the regulations and policies that you and I both work within every day and translate those to make sure our products meet every technical requirement. We also have Susan Reszczynski, Sales Engineer for EROAD. Susan brings knowledge from both carrier and driver perspectives, and we like to call her the bridge between customers and product. And with that, I will pass it over to Soona and Susan.
Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning, everyone.
My name is Soona.
My name is Susan.
And we will be talking you through the implementation key points. The purpose of this presentation is to make sure that we give you the insights from the experience that Susan and I have had with many of our carriers that have gone through the journey of implementing the ELD technology. Now, there's a lot of steps that look daunting at the outset, but if we actually really go through them in detail and show an understanding of what those steps really entail, it's easy to kind of, when you break those down into smaller pieces, they're less daunting and it's manageable. So the purpose of this webinar today is to put you in that driving seat with respect to this implementation.
Yes, and it is an art. It's not a science, but with what we do, we definitely have the luxury of seeing all different types of carriers, all sizes, different types of verticals. And so having that experience looking at all of that, we do have a lot of knowledge and thought that everybody's kind of tired of hearing about the mandate right now and the compliance dates and all that. Everybody seems to be ready to go, but kind of a bunch of confusion out there. And so we're definitely ready to share our knowledge with you and what we've seen, because we've seen a lot of stuff over the last 6 months.
That's true. So during the session, our purpose will be to cover some of the key steps that any implementation will have to go through, and what will it mean to get you to success. Now, it is a step. This whole program requires working closely between the ELD provider and you as the carrier and your team. So what can you ask your ELD providers, because it takes two parties to make this work, and how do you build that trusted partnership to make sure that this becomes a successful journey? And then some of the tips from what Susan and I have experienced working with our customers. What are some of the key tips that we have for you to build that operational strategy around the implementation? So essentially, at the end of this webinar, our goal is to help you take out that guesswork with respect to implementation and show you how to plan ahead for this success. So some of the key steps towards a successful ELD implementation. So these are the key steps that are involved with any implementation. And so we will go through what you need to look out for, what you need to think about, and how you will need to plan ahead with these steps. It's as easy as 1, 2, 3.
Yes.
So the first step is with installing the ELD, Second is to set up your backend system, and third is to train your team. We saw with respect to this, the poll we just took, that many of you feel that training is a huge concern for you when it comes to implementation. So we will go through how you can start to think about training your team, because it will be a key step in the ELD implementation. So first off, how the installation process takes place. When you are starting that installation, it's really pivotal for you to have in mind what kind of list that you will need to have for installation. So you will need to have compiled the list of all of your vehicles, because this will identify how many units you will need and how many installs you will have to do. And in this vehicle list, you will need to include the VIN number, the vehicle identification number, the make, model, and the year. And as you know, when it comes to an ELD, there are some exemptions around certain types of vehicles. As we all know that pre-2000 vehicles are exempt, and it's voluntary for you to have an ELD. And they may require a very different type of installation compared to the ELD, to the vehicles that have an ECM and are newer. And so check for that compatibility between the ELD you choose and the vehicles that you have on your list, because the cables and the connectors that you may require for those vehicles may vary.
Yes, and if you don't have a list already made, and if you haven't updated that vehicle list in a while, that's something that we've been finding, is that sometimes carriers say, oh yeah, we have a complete list of vehicles, they have it right there, but it's incomplete. Some of the VIN numbers are missing, some of the make models are wrong, maybe they've got vehicles that have been on this list for a while and they're retired or they're just sitting in the yard. So make sure it is up to date. And also, if you don't have a spreadsheet or a list, ask your provider, your ELD provider. We have a blank list, like a form that we give our customers that they could use that has all of the required information that we need to help onboard you to make sure that you're successful in getting all the proper cables and all that kind of stuff. So just, you know, reach something that you could reach out and ask for that list. But please make sure that if you haven't done so already, you know, if you have 20 trucks, it's not as daunting as if you have about 150, 200 and up. So make sure you've got all of those vehicle lists up to date and correct.
Okay, that's some good tips in there, Susan. So in terms of the installation process itself, there are some options that you will have presented to you in terms of how you get those installed. Some providers will enable you to self-install with your mechanics being trained up and ready to go, or you may choose to work with a third-party certified installer that knows how to install them correctly in your device, in your vehicle. And then, you know, there comes with it some guarantees and warranties around, you know, the way it is installed, so that if you run into any issues, that they can be resolved quickly. Or you can have the provider provide the install, and with that, you will just need to ask for what that upfront cost will be associated with doing so. Now, one of the things with respect to the way it's installed, it's really important that you think about this, because when it comes to the device, and if there are any malfunctions, we all know that when there is a malfunction, you will have 8 days in order for that to be resolved. Now, if you have installed it correctly and did all your things right at the beginning with respect to that device, it will minimize that risk of having any malfunctions come up due to improper installation, because there's a lot of things that can go wrong in terms of that connectivity between the ECM in the vehicle and that device. And so just make sure that you do invest and think up front about the options that you choose for how you install that device in your vehicle. And then the last thing that we've come across with a lot of our carriers is, you know, installing all of these devices, ELDs, into the vehicles can take your vehicles off the roads. And so think early and schedule for these installs. Make sure that you can find a good time working with your dispatchers and your fleet managers to identify the time and location suitable for those vehicles. You know, you want to minimize as much interruption to your operations as possible, and make sure that it's not pulling a vehicle off the road in order for there to be an install. So schedule things early. Make sure you work with your team to get those times identified.
Yes, and make sure, just what Soona said, you write everything down. And what we've seen is multiple different methods of operation where either everybody wants to do it all at once, so it's kind of an all hands on deck thing where all of the vehicles are maybe on a Saturday or Sunday, and they train the installs, they put the installs in, they get everything done all at once. And then another method, strategy would be to, these trucks on this day, this truck's on this day, depending on what the driver's schedules are, or if there's a vehicle down or something like that. Just make sure that you have it organized and you have it written down, because we have, 90 days left, Soona, before everything needs to be out on the road. So, keep to your schedule as much as possible, and that's something else that we've seen is, as you know, trucking can be very, very volatile sometimes, where not everything happens the way you plan it to. Just make sure that you have your schedule built in with a little flexibility, but you stick to it as close as possible. And what Soona said is make sure that it's installed correctly, because if it's not, then you're just going to have that truck in there again, and the drivers are involved with malfunction codes and stuff like that. So very important to do it right, lay it out correctly from the
first
get-go.
time. That's great. So moving to the second step, setting up the back-end part of the system. So with respect to ELDs, there will be some time that you will need to invest in terms of setting up all of the different users, including your drivers, into the system. So when it comes to that, with paper, there were individuals in your company that would have been responsible for managing those driver logs, overseeing your drivers. So will those individuals continue to be in those roles and managing that driver's information? If so, then those are the users that need to be trained up and ready to go in terms of setting up all of the parts of the system that requires seeing the driver's logs. So identify those correct individuals in your company that will be managing the driver logs, and set them up with the correct user profile. So in the ELD mandate, it refers to the support users who will have that oversight of the driver logs, and give them that right access level to be able to manage the information as it comes into the system. One of the other things that we've started to notice with the back-end system and these setups is that your information is protected by the security of the PIN numbers and the passwords that you give to the individuals, including your drivers, giving them their own PIN code to be able to access their own logs. So what are your policies and expectations to help them manage that? Because it's individualized and it's personalized information. And so how do you want to protect that driver's privacy? In order for you to make sure that that is protected, it is important for you to identify what your expectations are around how you keep those information safe, who is able to use that information, and what they will need to do to make sure that it doesn't get breached. So if there is a breach, what is expected and how the resets need to take place. So those are some of the things that you may want to think about early, and make sure that all of the team members that need to be aware are in the know.
Yeah, and another thing, talking about identifying the individuals responsible for managing the driver logs, it's really important now in this digital era that we're in. You might have had somebody that was in charge of collecting those driver logs and helping the drivers when they weren't wrong, auditing them. Now, when you have these users set up, they're going to be the ones that have the ability to suggest edits to the drivers, and they actually have more information visible to them, like the driver's license information and things like that. So there's a lot more information that they have access to. And also, whenever they make a suggested edit or change to that driver's logs, it's noted. Mm-hmm. So you get to see who did it and when. So not only is there those individuals that you have to identify that have that level and that authorization for that, but also then there's going to be someone on top of that that is going to be auditing those individuals that are making the log edits. Because before, on paper, there's no track of that. Who's making the edits, who's doing that, who's changing the logs, or who's helping, the the drivers, you know, the final copy is the final copy. But here, every time you make an edit, it date timestamps it and it stays on there. So you want to see that and it shows who did it. So someone has to be above that actually monitoring and auditing who's actually doing the auditing of the driver's log. So different types of roles and responsibilities that we want you to see that there comes with the era of ELDs and technology. Yeah. Highly visible everything that's done now.
Yeah. And so work with the provider and the system to understand what levels of access there are available in the system and who is appropriate to be given those levels of access.
Yes, and then if you want it per fleet, if you want it per terminal, so lots of different things to think about that we didn't have to think about before.
Correct. Okay. Now training. We saw with the poll and the concerns that you have about this, that training is a huge component of implementation. You know, one thing that I would like to say is, you know, when it came to adopting any other technology, especially those of you that are familiar with fleet management technologies, the devices usually had to just go in the truck and there was no training required or interaction from the driver at all. It was just collecting the data in the background and it was just doing things without any driver interaction. Now with ELDs, it is primarily the driver that is going to interact with these devices, and it's doing things for the driver throughout the day. And so for that reason, it is pivotal and it's really important to make sure that all the drivers receive the same level of training and awareness about how this technology is going to work for them. And so some of these things here, Susan and I will go through, that are areas where your drivers will require some level of training or understanding, because there is differences between the paper, if they are used to paper, to this ELD, and also if they were used to other technologies like automatic onboard recording devices, AOBRDs, which are legacy platforms, then there are some changes that are going to be made from that to an ELD as well. So Susan, do you want to go through a couple of these? Because I know, you know, when we work with a lot of our carriers that have onboarded, we had to go through some of these trainings. So.
Yes, we do a lot of driver safety meetings and things like that, or individual training with drivers, or training dispatch or safety folks so that they can actually train the drivers. So multiple different layers and levels here of training. But this is something that we put so that you'll be able to use this. If you do the bare minimum, this is like the bare minimum the drivers need to know what to do to be successful using the device. So they have to be able to know how to log in and log out of the device with their personal PIN, which what Soona said before is you need to make sure they know that they don't share that with anybody, because that's how they access their logs in whatever truck they get in and out of. They have to be able to know how to change that duty status. They might need to be able to hit the drive once in a while, but it's all automatic once that vehicle hits 5 miles an hour, but they still need to know all of the duty statuses. They haven't changed. It's another thing that we found out is some of the drivers are misunderstanding that the hours of service rules have changed. Nothing about the hours of service rules and regulations have changed. It's still the off-duty, on-duty, sleeper berth, and drive. Those are all those drive categories, but they need to understand that there's 2 special driving categories here that were added. So they've got yard moves and they've got personal conveyance now. Now personal conveyance is the same as it is with paper, but now there's different caveats to when they hit the personal conveyance to use it and when they have to go out of it. Those are still manual entries where they have to hit when they go in and they have to hit when they go out. And anytime they go into personal conveyance, they have to put a remark on there for why they're using personal conveyance. So there's also training with remarks. Now every time you make an edit, you use personal conveyance and other types of things, the driver has to put a remark. So there's you always want to make sure that they're putting appropriate things down there in case you ever needed to show it to anybody, like enforcement, or unfortunately if you get in a litigation situation. So training there on entering remarks. So reviewing, editing, annotating logs. Annotating is remarking on those logs, making sure that the driver knows how to do that from the device. Certifying the logs, because even though the ELD itself takes most of the form and manner elements out for getting violation, there's still 3 that they can get. They still need to add their trailer information, they still need to certify their logs every day, and they still need to make sure that they're daily doing their bill of lading and their shipping information. So they definitely need to know how to go through a roadside inspection. There is inspection mode on the ELD itself. So the drivers, they need to know they don't just hand the device out the window and say, here you go. there's protocols and there's a way that they perform the roadside inspection. They get in inspection mode, and then from there, it prompts them through, but you need to show them where that is and what the expectation is. So it's, terrible enough when the driver gets pulled over and he's stressed enough, so you don't want him at that point in time to have to be like, oh gosh, how do I do this? So make sure you give him the tools ahead of time so he knows what to do in that situation.
Yeah, and at the roadside, that's a really good point, Susan. One of the things that it's really important to train the drivers on is how they navigate through to transfer the ELD data to the inspectors using the right modes on that ELD. And also to be able to display in case that functionality of data transfer is not available. So what are the backup options? How do you display all of your information that has been captured on that ELD to the inspector and go through that with the inspector? Because we have heard from a lot of inspection cadre that if you have not trained the drivers to be able to walk through that with the inspector, then it could potentially mean that the driver does not actually have a log because they can't present that to the inspector. So just make sure that this is a key area that requires a bit of training for the drivers and knowing how to show that inspector all of the different parts of the driver's logs.
Yes. And then malfunction and data diagnostics. So, realistically, it's technology. You will have malfunctions. You will have data diagnostic codes. So, letting the drivers know ahead of time that, the unit's not going to blow up, the truck's not going to get shut off if these things come up, that, it's built into the mandate that, these things have to show up. A lot of them, it's just like a copy machine. There's just certain little buttons they need to press. Sometimes they can clear the malfunctions themselves. Sometimes it's a little bit more involved where they need to get hold of you. But making sure that they know ahead of time what to do. If this happens, you do this. If it hits this number, you do this. Let us know. So that, again, just like the roadside inspections, they have all that down. So when it happens, it's not that big of a deal, because it's really not that big of a deal. But if they don't know how to do it and you haven't trained them on that, it's going to be a big deal. And then determine the appropriate time that you're going to train your drivers and how you're going to train them. So you could maybe take the approach that you're going to train the drivers all at once in a safety meeting, and you're going to train them in a safety meeting at the same time that you're installing all the devices. Or you might install the devices first and not turn on the ELD component and then maybe train the drivers one at a time. You might, depending on what your provider has to offer for training materials, you might use videos. You might have the drivers do it on their own time. So determine the appropriate time, and do it in conjunction with your install. Determine what that strategy will be, and we'll talk about that in a little bit when we get into the strategy part of the presentation. But just determine the appropriate time and how you're going to train the drivers and what works best. Think of your operations and think about your drivers. Think about, if it's first thing on a Saturday morning, you're bringing them at 6 o'clock in the morning and you've got, an hour to do it and they want to get out of there, if that's going to be the most effective method, or if there might be a more effective method depending on, the personality and the time frame and when your driver schedules. This is very, very, very important. This part here, it's initial training, it's your onboarding training, it's their first introduction to that device. So how you do it is very important. It's not going to be the end of your training, trust me. You're going to have more training after everybody's out there using it. Then you're going to get the second round of questions and expletives and all that kind of stuff where you'll have to address. But at first, lay good groundwork. Give your drivers the tools they need to be successful right off the bat. How you set up this first initial training will determine how successful they'll be. And then the fleet managers, safety managers, dispatchers, mechanics, anybody that's going to be jumping into that truck that needs to log in and log out is going to need some type of training. So support users in the back end, reviewing, editing, and annotating those drivers' logs from the back end system. So not only do drivers need training, all of the staff that's going to be involved with the system is going to be needing some level of training, even if they're doing like a tax platform that hasn't have anything to do with the ELD. But so depending on what you're using and what platform, and if you have safety involved, where there's safety aspects of the technology. So think of all that when you're developing the training, like who's going to need it, how much time, and what the most effective way to be that. But very important to train, and be very effective with your training.
Yeah, one comment I would like to point out here, seeing how a lot of our customers move on from paper to electronic, there are additional things that, will come and be visible to the back office staff that wasn't available before. In particular, when it comes to editing, the way you would have to edit, it could be different. And also, with some systems, and EROAD being one, there are additional information that the back office staff can have to be able to manage that driver's logs and audit them better. For example, making sure that you're on top of those, hours of service compliance and having that violations be shown so that you can actually see which of the drivers need more coaching around hours of service, need more training around hours of service, and it is the fleet managers and the safety managers that will need to know and how to navigate the system to see those. Unidentified driving trips is a completely new concept with respect to ELDs. How those need to be resolved, because it needs to either be assigned or be annotated and explained as per the FMCSA's clarification about how you close off those unidentified trips. It's important to have somebody oversee all of those trips that do arise and how you actually get them to close, because during an audit process, they will be exposed and they will be something that will need to be that will be asked a lot of questions on. So it's important to have different people in your business have the key roles clarified, and also the understanding about what they need to do on the system to achieve the outcome required. So, okay, those are the three key steps everybody has to go through. Now, what can you ask your ELD provider to assist you through this process? Because, again, it takes two to make this thing go right. And there are three key pillars from our perspective that needs to be there in order for this to be successful. There needs to be coordination, there needs to be communication, and there needs to be collaboration. So, let us go through how the ELD provider can support you along this journey, and what you can ask the provider to help you with throughout this process. So in terms of coordinating your own plan, to get to this plan, you need to know up front some of the expected timeframes and the methods of delivery of the particular aspects. First of all, how long will it take to get those units dispatched to you with the accessories? The earlier that you know these expected timeframes, the better it enables you to plan ahead for what's next. You need to get the installation up and running in order for you to have the drivers see it and then be trained on it and experience that technology. So what is that runway time between you and that provider? Installation per vehicle. You know that you have to go through and install each of those units into your vehicles. How long will it actually take per vehicle to go through? That enables you to factor in how long you need to have in terms of that runway leading up to the compliance date. Another key area that you want to know how long it will take is around how long it takes to troubleshoot any issues that you encounter throughout that implementation journey. If you have any issues that come up during your installation process or throughout your training and your drivers have questions, who do you go to and how long will it take for you to get a response back? Make sure that you discuss these up front with your provider to make sure that you have a clear set expectations for when you can receive these things so that you can stick to your plan and your strategy for your implementation.
Yes, and another thing with that is make sure that it's very much communicated and coordinated, the method of the delivery of the communication. So, dispatching of the units, and we all know there's multiple different ways to communicate between organizations now. So whether instant messaging, whether you're going to get a text, whether it's going to be email. So your folks that are doing this, they might communicate best and it's easiest through email, or it might be a phone call. Make sure that you have that ahead of time, like who I get a hold of, what's the best way to get a hold of them, what's the best method to deliver the information that you need, so that everybody's getting what they need in the method that's easiest for them. Some of our carriers don't even have cell phones. So, making sure that they're understanding, okay, well, if we need to get a hold of you, what's the best method to get a hold of you? And, sometimes the phones don't work. So emails or other ways, or sometimes we have, we're here in Tualatin, sometimes we have our customers come in here to get what they need. But make sure that you have that, and make sure the dispatch of the units brings up a good point, Soona. Especially now, so we're down within 90 days. The dispatch of the units, make sure that you know when they're coming, because been hearing out in the marketplace that a lot of folks are backed up. So if you get this whole strategy and you get this whole plan down and you're going to get this installation, thing down that Susan and I have been talking about, and then, you get to this point here and you're like, oh, one, dispatch of our units, we're going to get them here, and they say we can't deliver them until November, that's going to throw kind of a wrench in the whole plan. So make sure you got that down and make sure you have this down and it's coordinated well with your provider.
Yeah. Communication. I think Susan just briefly touched on how important it is to have that open communication between the two parties to make this successful. Understand who needs to be involved and when. Identify the key staff within your organization that will need to be communicating with the provider. And same thing, understand who it is throughout the process that you will be communicating with in order for you to get what you need. So throughout the installation process, you may want to work with the people in the provider that will be dispatching the unit to you, that will be providing that installation process and working you through that. So who is that person, and how do each party get a hold of each other? As you go through the implementation steps, and you have requirements that you need for your different parts of your team, who is it within the ELD provider that you can actually get to know and have that primary point of contact? And then as you have those technical issues come up and need them to be resolved urgently, what is that number to call, or what is the email address to email things through to get that urgent request addressed?
Yep, and make sure all of your key staff have that. Have it written on a piece of paper, laminate it, whatever. Put it up for the dispatchers, put it up for your mechanics. Make sure your drivers know, who to call, like within your organization. And then we need to know who to call, who's your main folks on that end of it. So very, very important. Very simple step, but very, very, very important.
And then collaborate to meet the key objectives. Knowing ahead of time where to go and how to get all the help that you need. Whether it be, especially around that training, as we talked about, where can you access the user manuals, the training materials, any instructions that the provider already has made for you, and then where are those quick help tools so that you can go and help yourself through that process. Any issues that you may have or questions that you may have, how can you answer that? And have your drivers access it quickly so that they can be out on the road and make sure that they can do the right thing. So make sure that you can collaborate with the provider to give you all the tools that you need for your team so that they can be up and running as fast as possible.
Yeah, might be very helpful to know that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Some of the materials you'd use for your training are already available. So see what's available, what you need to do, and if you need to customize it a little bit, and ask your provider if they could, what if they have a train the trainer, or if there's something that's customizable you could use. But yeah, there's a lot of help out there, and there's a lot of training materials out there, so make sure you know what's available for you to make it easier for you when you're implementing.
Okay, so building your strategy. I know we've talked about this word strategy a lot, so let's go through a little bit about what that really means and then drill that down into what are those tips that we can provide you to build your own strategy. So strategy, here's a quick definition: a plan of action or a policy designed to achieve a major or overall aim. There's two parts to what is a strategy. There's the formulation of a strategy, analyzing the environment and making a diagnosis to develop your policy, and then implementation. What are the actions that you need to take to make that happen? So those two things, let's go through how you can build your own strategy and some of the tips and tools that Susan and I have kind of seen as we've walked through that journey with our customer. So, know thyself. Knowing who you are, what your operation requires, you're the expert around your operations. So you're the best at knowing what you will need in order for you to be successful.
And what we're finding with a lot of our onboardings with carriers is that paper processes don't have a lot of visibility. So when moving to a paperless system, there's a lot more questions and a lot more things that have to be kind of dialed in that the carriers are finding that they might not know themselves as much as they thought they did. They're having to understand, look up like, oh, I don't have this truck registered correctly, or, oh, I never thought about who was doing that, or who's doing this in our business, and find out, oh, nobody's doing it, or, there's a couple people doing it, or you just don't have a process or a policy or any type of guidelines in place whatsoever. So just cut yourself some slack, know that you're going to come up with some things, and you're going to have to possibly come up with some new procedures on doing things. And you will have some frustrating moments where you might need to understand that you might not have been doing stuff correctly, or that you may not have been in compliance. I mean, we're only in compliance until we're not. So make sure that you understand, take the time to look at what you're doing right now. If you have a question where a driver or someone says, hey, how do I do this with the new system? You say, okay, what are we doing now? Okay, we're doing it this way. Okay, well, what's the best way then? We can continue to do it that way with the least amount of displacement with the new technology and actually make it better. A lot of times you get that visibility, you can see where your operational inefficiencies are, and a lot of our customers have come up with great ideas and policies and procedures. It just can be a little bit more of a process than you might be anticipating. So when that happens, if that happens and those things come up, just make sure that, okay, time to set up some new policies with this and move on. Make sure that your operations, whether they're in the shop or whether they're dispatch operations or whether they're your safety folks that are doing stuff, or your billing and support people, that if they're doing something a certain way now, that it might need to change, that everybody's okay with that. You might need some new roles and responsibilities. Again, what we find that sometimes that, well, who is doing this now? Oh, well, okay, we don't know. Or they're doing it now, but now they don't need to do their VTRs anymore. So what are they going to be doing? Okay, well, they could be now auditing logs, or they could be taking care of those unassigned events that Susan was talking about. So just, you need to be a little bit more flexible and looking at the operations and placing them in the new things, and make sure that you're properly staffed and you set that up right from the beginning during your onboarding process, and not leaving it till, you come to an auditing situation where you have to figure it out. Onboarding programs, training and key staff, and developing that stuff. And then this webinar is about onboarding, but wanting you to understand that this is going to be a process that's going to last for quite a while. And everything that we've talked about, making sure that you're communicating well and you have a great relationship with your provider, because this is going to be going on for a while. So setting up your onboarding and initiating all of this, but setting it up in a way where it's going to continue, and it can continue on its own. You're going to need to continually onboard drivers. You're going to get new drivers, and for those of you that have high driver turnover, making sure that you've got an onboarding program for any time someone new comes on, driver training, new hires. What does that onboarding look like for them? It's going to continue. New staff, somebody's doing something, whether they quit, leave, retire, whatnot, keep that onboarding program in place so that anybody that new that comes on, you already have it set up, and you set it up from the beginning here, and you set it up well, and then you could just continue to use it and continue to modify it to get better and better and better. But it's an ongoing process. So we're talking about initial onboarding, but think about that long term for when you need to continually onboard in those situations.
In terms of the way you would need to approach the implementation and how you strategize around this, you may want to phase it out. And I think the biggest successes that we have seen with our customers have been when they have really taken the time to break down these large, daunting tasks of onboarding everybody in the organization into smaller, manageable pieces. And so for example, divide training into different functions or tasks on the ELD. It seems really intuitive, but I think when at the beginning we go, oh, you have to train the driver on the ELD, you don't know where to start. So the one of the easiest ways that we've found success with the drivers and getting them understanding the technology is to just start off small. How do you log in? How do you log out? How do you change the duty status? When does it change? So small functions or small tasks, the driver can go through that individually, and then have them learn new features or new functions and new tasks as they get familiar with the old ones. That's one strategy that you can adopt. set up one terminal at a time instead of going, one big bang implementation across your whole entire organization, which can have multiple terminals. Think about how you can start off with one, take the lessons from there, and then move on. So, for example, you may have 3 different terminals in 3 different, places. Those 3 locations, start off with one, and then as you train, the drivers in there, move on to the next one, start installing in another location, set up the users there, train the drivers there. So go through it at one terminal at a time has been a successful strategy for a couple of our customers.
And group of users could be, the group of users means you might decide to train your office staff first and get them all, using a train-the-trainer model so that they understand the system and they've got a lot of the questions already, and then the next group you would train might be the mechanics, and then the next group you might train would be, the last group might be the drivers, so that way when they have questions on stuff that you already have in-staff assistants available that they've already been trained. So when you look at this and you're going back and saying group of users at a time, think that too. So internally could be your back-end staff that gets trained first, or the driver. So take that into consideration when if you're going to phase it out.
Exactly. And then this one seems intuitive. However, it's pivotal for everybody to come together and actually set some clear targets and expectations as to what they need to do. So document some of the key timelines that you expect everybody to stick to with some key deliverables. For example, you may want to make sure that all of your back office staff are set up by a certain time. In terms of that, make sure that the person that is doing the setup, whether it is with your ELD provider, each party knows what they need to do. And then once they're set up, what is the next phase, and what is the timeline for that? Once you document it, and have everybody stick to that, there builds that accountability for making sure that everybody knows what is expected and what is the time frame, so that you can achieve everything coming up to that December time frame, which is, like Susan said, less than 90 days away.
Yes, and so when Susan's talking about these timelines, make sure you understand within the next 90 days, when you're setting up and assigning responsibilities, make sure that those folks that are doing that have the availability. Somebody might be going on vacation a big chunk of time during Thanksgiving, and then Christmas is coming up. So make sure that when you're doing that, okay, are these people available? And when I say people, drivers, staff, the people that are assigning the responsibilities, upper management for the buy-in. So make sure that those folks that you're assigning those responsibilities to are available, and be aware of the holidays coming up and all of the vacation time and things like that.
Yeah. So with these, we found that one of the key advantages or opportunities this presents is that you can share the lessons of onboarding in one part of the business and share it with others. What can you improve on as you go along this journey? Because you may find that something works best for you, and in the culture that you have with your staff, that may not be the same for another company. So what works best for you, fine-tune that throughout that path you take. And this is a great time, and Susan alluded to this earlier, to take stock of your company policies and practices that you have. There are some new things that will be introduced with ELDs, so look at how you are doing things now and make sure that you have set some clear boundaries for how they are supposed to work. So for example, define and outline the criteria and restrictions for when you can use yard move, where you use them, and how you use them, as well as personal conveyance. How long are you expected to use that, for what, for when, and what, and for which drivers. Set out some clear expectations for the drivers around the reviewing, editing, and submitting of logs. Susan, I know you have a lot of stories around this one too.
Yes, make sure you've got a clear understanding. With the ELD mandate, the drivers have the ability to edit their own logs from the device. We also have the back office staff having the ability to suggest edits. So when you are thinking about policies and practices from the get-go with your onboarding, are you setting out the expectation that the drivers are going to edit their own logs, that they're responsible? So Federal Motor Care is pushing that they want the drivers to be responsible for their logs. They are for their paper. Same thing with here. So if you get into that, you're going to help them, and you will be able to suggest edits to their logs all the time, what are you setting up there? So have the expectation set out, have the policy. We expect you to edit your logs, and then you move back to the training thing. If you're going to expect it of them, you need to train them on it. But that way, they're doing their logs, they're expected to be able to edit it, review it, so when they submit it, you have a full compliant log there. So if you're putting the onus on yourself that, hey, you know, if you don't do it, you know, we'll do it for you, then you get into roles and responsibilities. Okay, then who's going to be doing that? Do we have them set up correctly? And then who's going to be auditing their work to make sure that they're doing it correctly? And then when the drivers do it from the device, it's instant. They edit, it goes right there. If you're editing it from the back office, it gets pushed back out to the driver again. He's got to review it, he's got to accept it, and then he's got to recertify his logs. So when you are doing your company policies and your practices, when you have these things, set the expectations from the beginning. It's a lot easier than changing it later. As we know, drivers love change. So put that up ahead of time, train them, and make sure that you're understanding when you set up these policies and practices, you might be doing yourself a disservice and the drivers if you set it out a certain way. My suggestion is you push it to the driver. You make sure that they know that they're responsible for their logs, they're protected, and that you can suggest edits once in a while, but that they're responsible for doing that. And make sure that you're developing, getting to the next one, your policies for log in and log out for all of your staff so you don't have unidentified events. Develop your contingency plans for scenarios with malfunctions like we talked about earlier, and make sure you're continuing to review and update these. And this is something that I know is a challenge for most folks because maybe you do it once a year, maybe you do it as needed, but this is as needed. It is as needed now, going from paper to this technology and non-paper. It's time to do those, and it's time to set them up right. And thinking long term, we've covered this like through the whole time. It is a presentation about onboarding, and so you're thinking onboarding, yeah, okay, I got a month or two, and then check that box, done. You know, think what else you're going to get with this. What are those policies and procedures going to be long term? And then with the ELD, I mean, since you have to have it, what other benefits can you get with the ELD? Is that extra visibility on all of your fleet and the insights on all of your fleet going to be helping with your ROI, or are you just going to have ELDs with the vehicles that need them? So if you have 3 vehicles that need ELDs and then you have 10 more, maybe light vehicles, or they meet one of the exemptions, you might see that over time, hey, having that visibility and that insight and that information on those other trucks might be actually beneficial for my operations. Proactively managing driver behavior, is that going to help you? And then going to the bottom bullet there, utilizing those safety features. So right now, we have some partners that are insurance companies, and so this better bet comes from them. So if you're proactively managing a full fleet driver behavior and you are utilizing safety features, and you could visibly show and document show that you are getting safer and you're improving your safety culture within your organization, long-term thought for having an ELD, you might be able to lower your insurance rates, which, as we know, are astronomical. But if you're the better bet for an insurance company and you can drop your insurance rates, these things will pay for themselves. So, onboarding, think about that as you're onboarding. What extra things are you getting with your ELD? And then, hey, if I do this with an ELD, or if I start looking at the safety features, long term, I can actually get them to pay for themselves, and then, hey, operationally, I will be more successful, and we're going to work smarter, not harder. So think long term with this whole ELD process and onboarding, and what else you're going to get out of it. And with that, I think that's our last slide, and we're on to our Q&As, which Brittany has some here that we're going to read out.
Yes, thank you both for that valuable information. I think everyone will find it very useful for them on this journey. We do have a few questions to go through. So the first one was just, what does ELD stand for? What is an ELD, and how do I know if my fleet needs to be compliant?
That's a great question. ELD stands for Electronic Logging Devices. There was a rule that was published by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, FMCSA, that says, all of the drivers that are currently required to keep a paper logbook needs to now use an electronic logging device to capture their record of duty status. So there are only certain number of exemptions that are available to carriers. Other than that, everybody else that currently keeps a paper logbook to record their hours of service will need to transition to an ELD by December 17th of 2017 this year.
And so that kind of leads me into the next question. Is this requirement for vehicles, over 10,000 pounds or just over the 26,000 pounds?
It depends. So if you ask yourself what we talked about in the presentation, what are you doing now? So if you're required to do a paper log now, you're going to need an ELD. And there's a great, FMCSA has great information on their website. And I don't know the whole, www, just all you need to do is www.fmcsa plus ELD, and you can get to the Federal Motor Carrier website, and it'll tell you if you need to have an ELD or not. But think about what you do now. Your drivers might be using time cards, they might be using logs. So there's caveats to that. Just go to the Federal Motor Carrier website to see if you're exempt or not. But it's gonna, if you need to do a paper log now, you're gonna need an ELD more than likely.
Perfect. Thank you, Susan. And do you know if the DOT will apply a penalty fee if the driver can't show his historical hours on the device?
So, as we all know, in terms of the roadside inspection, the driver has to carry with him the current logs and the last 7 days worth of logs. Now, in terms of the way in which the driver may carry that, it could be in the all on the ELD, or if there were at times when the driver had to use paper logs because they had to jump into an older truck that didn't have an ELD or whatever, they may carry that days worth of logs on paper and then the remainder on the ELD, or update the ELD to have all of that information, because many of the ELDs will have the ability to go back and enter all of that past hours of service information as well. So it's important for the driver to understand how they can insert all of that past duty statuses to make sure that they have the 8 days if they are required to have that information.
There's multiple different ways to get it to the enforcement officer, and from what we've been told, CVSA starting December 18th of this year will be doing penalties only. So they will be penalizing the drivers if they can't show that they have an ELD, and then if they are not able to show the data that you're talking about. But they won't start the out of service of that type of stuff until April of 2018. But yes, so this question, yes, if they can't show the data, yes, they will be penalized, they'll get a citation or get written up. But caveat, there's multiple different ways to get that information to them with an ELD, whether it's paper, filling it in at the time, or having the back office send the information to the officer.
Okay, great. And our next question is, what about when the tractor gets put into a shop and a substitute tractor is used?
Great question. So the ELD is required come December of this year, even on those vehicles that need to be maintained. So it's important for you to make sure that the driver knows, how to quickly use that new ELD or the ELD that's installed into the other vehicle. It could be a different one. So just make sure that the different the driver understands what they need to do. Now, there is actually an exemption that is pending with respect to short-term rental vehicles. So if you have one of your vehicles that goes down on the road, that you need to replace it with another truck for a short period of time to tie it over, that particular vehicle may or may not have an ELD, and at this point in time, you may be able to just have that driver keep paper because of that exemption, but it's not out yet. So everybody is still waiting to hear on how FMCSA proposes the drivers to operate in that environment. But if you have that substitute truck and that substitute truck has an ELD installed, then the driver needs to be able to operate that. So make sure that your drivers are trained on and ready to go if they were not used to using that ELD, and then now they are. So.
Yeah. Or if you might want to, we're talking about onboarding, so policies and procedures set up to where your mechanics might need to know how to take the one ELD from the one vehicle and transfer it to another vehicle. So the ELDs can be movable as well, but make sure you have that set up ahead of time. Installs could take 10, 15 minutes, half an hour, depending on what type of device you have. So they can be moved to another vehicle, but like Soona said, make sure that drivers know I can't move without it, and the mechanics know how to install it, and you've got that policy and procedure in place before that happens.
And thank you guys so much. Are the ELDs employee specific? Our guys may use several different trucks during a day for different projects.
Employee specific. So when the driver has his driver PIN, that's basically his log. So the ELD is attached to the truck. So the driver is attached to his logs through his PIN number. So the driver can go from truck to truck to truck to truck, and as long as he inputs his PIN number into any ELD, his logs will be pulled from wherever he is. So that's where he goes from. But the ELD itself is actually to the truck, not employee specific.
Okay. And next question, do you recommend a device installed to a truck permanently, or possibly a removable tablet type device, and assign it to per driver as a carry-along in case of truck change?
Sure. So there are different types of ELDs out there in the market today. Some of them are bring your own devices, which means you can have your mobile device or your tablet device be the point that the drivers interact with. Now, you just have, so there are some technologies that are like that, and some that are in-cab tethered devices. Now, it just means that you need to be mindful of how those different technologies work. So with the in-cab systems, they will have permanent connections to the ECM, so they is less likely to have any issues with the connectivity failing, whereas BYODs, or that bring your own types of devices, which rely on Bluetooth connection between the mobile device and the hardware that's connected to the engine, if that drops at any point in time for a prolonged period of time, especially if it goes down for more than 30 minutes in any 24-hour period, then it can cause a malfunction that may not be able to clear. So just be aware of these types of things. But also, with respect to the mobile devices, FMCSA has provided guidance that it needs to be fixed mounted in the vehicle when the driver is driving. So work with the provider if you have that BYOD device to make sure that it is in a fixed place, that the driver can reach and see, but it needs to be done in a way that is compliant with the FMCSA's guidelines.
Yeah. And adding a little bit more on that, going back to our presentation, for the answer to that is know thyself. So know your drivers, know what they're capable of. If they're using, if you choose to use something with a tablet or things like that, they have to understand not only how to activate and use the ELD, but they need to know how to deal with that tablet, how to do updates on the tablet, make sure that you have a process in place for charging so that they're not out on the road and they can't access their hours of service because their tablet is dead, the battery's dead. So make sure that know thyself, what would work best operationally for you if you switch vehicles a lot, like that last question. So
how do they connect?
Which is better, understand how they connect, understand how your drivers will use it, understand how much more training or less training that will be, and decide based on your operations by knowing yourself and knowing what you're going to need and what that's going to entail and what will be easiest for you.
So we had a question about, will internet be required to download these logs?
In terms of the back office, yes, it will require use of an internet browser. Usually the back office systems with a lot of the ELD providers will be housed on the web portal. So that's how the back office will be able to access through the internet. In terms of the devices themselves, it could vary the way it's connected. So most of them will rely on some sort of connectivity, cell connectivity or satellite connectivity, to make sure that those logs can be downloaded and transferred. So just make sure that you work with those providers to understand how they work, because it does vary from provider to provider.
That is a great question.
And we are about out of time. There are some additional questions here. If we didn't get to yours during the session, we will follow up with you personally. Again, as a reminder, we'll send an email with the slides and recording, and we'll also be including an EROAD red paper that covers the topics so that you can share with colleagues who may also want the additional information. I would like to give a big thank you to our presenters, Susan and Soona, for your valuable information on ELD implementation. Here at EROAD, we believe in educating our customers, and that means having a staff that is highly knowledgeable about the ELD mandate and industry rules and regulations. With EROAD's ELD, yes, we have an ELD. You receive specialized onboarding support. The EROAD solution offers a complete suite of user-friendly fleet management, compliance, and driver safety solutions, including, of course, our FMCSA registered and third-party verified ELD. Our all-in-one solution provides electronic tax, fuel, and fleet utilization reporting, as well as vehicle maintenance and driver safety tools. And not to mention the real-time truck locations and hours of service data. If you'd like a demo, please contact the number on our screen. We'll see if we can pull that up for you, or email us personally with any questions that you may have. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for your time, and good luck on your journey, and I wish you well in your process and in knowing yourself and your operations.
Yeah, thank you for your time this morning.
There you go, number.
Thanks, you guys. Have a great day.